Welcome to today's webcast. My name is John Stevens, and I'll be your host today. My co-host is John Grange, CTO and founder at OpsCompass. We're having some difficulties this morning with the webcast platform. So hopefully you can hear us and it will go smoothly. We're having to kind of work around a couple of technology issues, but hopefully it'll go smoothly. If you can't hear us, please use the Q&A panel to let us know if you're having trouble, and we'll go from there. John, do you hear me okay?
I can hear you great.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and advance the slides and go to the first one and get going here. So like I said, welcome everyone. Today we're going to discuss the evolution of technical operations within product companies and technical organizations as a whole. We're going to discuss sort of the evolution of roles like engineering and network administration and DB administration, and how those have evolved to modern operations teams. Let's go to the next slide, John. Now on my end, I'm still seeing the first title slide. There we go. We'll cover a little bit of housekeeping, some introductions, and a little bit of background, and then we'll get right into the content. We can go ahead and go to the next slide.
You see it yet?
No, there's a lot of delay. I'm only seeing the housekeeping agenda slide.
I think the packets are moving through the internet slowly today.
You know, it's really a weird situation. I've never had this kind of problem in the hundreds of webinars that I've hosted, but it's okay. We'll figure out a way to get through it, and we'll just go from here. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the topic and getting started. And if you don't mind, John, let's go forward a couple slides. I changed the order, but I hadn't sent that back to you. So let's go forward one more, and then we'll come back to that. A little bit of housekeeping, if we'll go ahead and go to there. If you missed something on today's webinar, don't fret about it. We'll be emailing out a recorded version after the event that you can access. We will also, and I'll start it right, a product that I use called Otter, or otter.ai. And it's an artificial intelligence engine that will allow you to automatically transcribe calls and webinars and things like that live as they're happening. And so I'm going to try using that application during this event, and that will allow us to post the transcription to the attendees as well. So you'll be able to read what we talked about and kind of go from there. Okay, now let me get back to the screen where you are. If there's any questions, use the Q&A panel. We'll try to get to all the questions either live during the event or afterwards via email. I'm trying to follow up with you. Obviously, anytime you want to reach out to us, you can email Ben or any of those other panels. Okay, can we go back a slide now?
Sure.
I mentioned this earlier, but my name's Josh Stevens. You might know me from the work I've done at SolarWinds or Idera or Untitled. I've been around the technology industry for going on 30 years now, and have helped found and operate some really popular and successful companies. I'm really blessed today to have a co-host in John. John, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm John Grange. I'm co-founder and CTO of OpsCompass. We do SaaS software in the cloud security space, and my background's in, hosting, infrastructure. I've built a couple software companies that are SaaS oriented, and definitely a server nerd going back in the day. Was also a co-founder of a hosting company in the early 2000s where we were a top 5 global ASP.NET hosting provider. So lots of experience with servers and networking, and more importantly, getting customers' applications out of their own data centers and into somebody else's, whether that's the cloud or a colo facility or that sort of thing. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
John, you and I have both spent a lot of years in roles where we were doing sort of frontline technical operations. And it's one of my favorite subjects to talk about. I kind of thrive on those environments where you're in the hot seat and things are going up and down and you're troubleshooting, and customers are relying on you and your employees relying on you. I just kind of love the adrenaline of those types of situations. And so I'm really excited about talking about this topic today with you. For all the attendees out there, this format is going to feel more like a podcast than a webinar. So listening is important, but watching, not so much. Feel free to multitask, catch up on email, write a little code if you want to, or take a walk with the dog and get some fresh air and just listen. Because this is going to be about a conversation, and really we didn't put a lot of content in the slides because I'd like to just make this very conversational. Let's go ahead and go forward.
Sure.
So I'm looking for the slide, the evolution of tech ops.
Yep, that's where we should be at in the in the webinar.
A lot of delay between when you advance it and when it shows up on my end. Really wild. So I'm still on the introduction to the background slide on in Bright Talk. So let's talk a little bit about the evolution of tech ops. John, you've been doing this a while. Describe for us sort of what technical operations was like when you first got started.
Sure. I look at kind of tech ops or IT ops, kind of it's put up against something more modern like DevOps, and it's sort of the classic tech ops was really more rigid, and what we've moved towards today is something more flexible. So I look back at kind of tech ops in the beginning. It was very much about kind of this centralized IT department that is tending to infrastructure and sort of monolithic applications, and things of that nature. And the perimeter is really being more network oriented, whereas today the perimeter is sort of identity oriented, and things are much more flexible. And it's the DevOps concepts have sort of been infused into tech ops in a way that it's brought that, instead of being just about stability and security, it's about speed too. So it's really much different. But what I describe as where we kind of came from when I first started is it was, again, very rigid, very centralized.
Yeah, when I first got started, it was rigid, and the other thing that was different is, you had very strict specialties. The DBA likely didn't have a lot of network knowledge, and the network engineer likely didn't have a lot of programming background or application knowledge. And I think that this evolution to public cloud and, which started with virtualization, but now has put us in a true public cloud computing environment, has sort of deconstructed a lot of those concepts and forced us to look at the entire application ecosystem as one unit, as one living, breathing entity. And it's caused, all of us in these roles to evolve our skill sets and our way of thinking. And it's dramatically affected which skill sets that it takes to succeed in many of these roles. And, to give you an example, I would say that historically, unless you were in management, a VP or above in an IT organization, you probably didn't deal very much with contract negotiations, SLA validation as it relates to contracts, or even cost management, as part of your function. You buy hardware or software, you implement it for a need, and you just sort of ran it. But today, when you're in any form of technical operations, be it DevOps or IT ops or NetOps, a big part of your role is going to be how you deal with your vendors, because your cloud vendors, your app vendors, they handle some of what you would have been responsible for in a less modern, less cloud-like environment. And so in order to put yourself in a position to succeed, one of the key changes is that you have to have some background in business and in negotiating. And I think, John, that one of the symptoms of this, and this is a good thing, is that when you learn to negotiate and deal with vendors, whether your vendors are AWS or Google Cloud Platform or whomever, that also teaches you the basic skills needed to negotiate a better salary and to negotiate, different options that might occur to you as part of your career. Or at any point, if you decide to go out and do independent consulting, it really gives you an experience of an entrepreneur from within a well-established enterprise. And so I think it sort of changes the way that we think about the technology. Have you seen a similar change as your career has advanced, as in terms of the things that you have to think about now?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think about myself, and it's, hey, a lot of what I've learned over the years about product marketing, for instance, and I do, product vision at OpsCompass, has been from learning a lot from other software vendors and buying software and seeing the different pricing models, and kind of being around 10 or 15 years ago when like the open core kind of open source business model started to become popular with software, and you had to parse through these different sort of service agreements with open source software that you were using. So yeah, I think that that's a great point, actually, that it's a great career builder to be able to negotiate and interact and learn about how these companies are really going to market with their technology, and not just the kind of technical functions of it.
Yeah, I want to apologize to the attendees. To make this work, literally, I had to call John's phone, and he has his speakerphone, his iPhone, sitting by his laptop, and we're having to make it work that way. So I know that I don't sound as clear as you'd like as an attendee, and I apologize for that. We're dealing with a technical problem. The last thing I put on this slide was sort of who this affects. And the important thing to remember here is that the changes we're going to be talking about today would affect you regardless of whether you're new in your career or maybe even still in school and getting educated, or you've been in your career for many years and you're trying to advance. So we're going to sort of describe the skills and how they've adapted, and hopefully put you in a position to really succeed in this new and evolutionary environment. Let's go to the next slide, please. So let's start the discussion with two areas that I think are pretty easy to talk about, and this is IT ops and DevOps. IT operations is a pretty new term, so I'll save that for a second. But John, let's talk about DevOps. I mean, if you could compare what a software developer does today versus what we were doing when we were shipping prepackaged, shrink-wrap software, it's a very, very different style of engineering, wouldn't you say?
It's completely different, and I think at the heart of it is it's all about speed and release speed, and in the business context, it's speed without sacrificing kind of quality and stability. So it kind of almost harkens back to like the Ford assembly line, right? Like they, instead of making cars kind of onesie twosie and potentially having one be a piece of junk, having one be really good, and never really being able to scale, they needed to be able to sell cars at scale. So they built kind of an assembly line where at each step you could ensure that you weren't making a mistake, and at the end of the day you could produce a lot more cars. And that's really what's happened with software. We treat the development process like an assembly line that can be almost mechanized, and it's really changed. It's changed the face of all of these kind of departments in and around IT.
It's really wild to me because I got my start. The first software company I helped found was SolarWinds, and it's all shrink wrap software. You build it, you test it, you put it on a server somewhere, people download it and use it. Never in that scenario did I have to worry about cloud spend or AWS performance or intra-cloud latency or any of the issues we see today. And what I notice is that while salaries have gone up over the last few years for people in DevOps and IT ops, the skill sets required have gone up, I think, more significantly than the salaries. I think that in order to be successful in a DevOps world, you have to be great at cloud engineering and have stellar performance, stellar skills in engineering and software development. But you also have to understand how storage works and how memory works and how caching works and how networking works and subnets. I was working with a company yesterday, and we were sort of talking about how their cloud app would scale as they began going to market and ramping up customer count. And one of the things that the DevOps, or really the lead architect, hadn't thought much about was that the way that they were doing their elastic scaling, it didn't really account for subnet size. And they were going to have to add some new complexity because they were very quickly going to exceed the number of hosts you could put on that size subnet in the way that they'd architected the system. And that type of complication just didn't exist for software developers 10 years ago.
Yep.
You relied on someone else to deal with that.
Yep, it's the imposed constraints by the platform, right? You used to be able to take software and kind of run it however you wanted. I mean, I've seen customers run into that on the public cloud, Kubernetes services, where they're not used to having constraints around networking and the number of nodes, and they run into situations where they built their subnets too small, or even situations where the as an IT ops group, you're concerned about things like IP overlap. I was working with somebody here just a few weeks ago, and people had been deploying stuff out in the cloud and just using default IP addresses that the cloud assigned for them, and those overlapped with their internal IPs. Well, once they connected the cloud to on-prem because those projects became important, they had all sorts of IP problems and they had to redeploy everything.
That's a great story. The last AWS reInvent, before the lockdown, we were still doing live events, and I remember chatting with a guy who had built a really high-end sort of voice over IP transform service in the cloud. And the issue he was having is he was having latency within the AWS cloud that was affecting his app. But there was no way for him to get, diagnostics or even to really troubleshoot the issue, because the latency he was experiencing was within a part of the cloud that wasn't exposed with APIs, and there was no manageability. And so it was just sort of, dark to him. And I think that's one of the things we should talk about, is that early in the DevOps and public cloud lifecycle, it was very difficult to get analytics or performance metrics out of the public cloud. But today, those APIs have evolved to the point that products like OpsCompass can exist and function without having to have some sort of a virtual appliance or agent or something like that, deployed on the devices.
Yes, we've moved away. The cloud has sort of allowed us to move away from kind of line of sight tools where you need to have like a box in the network between something and some other thing, and you can go kind of ping APIs. I figured we'd talk about that when we talk a little bit more about NetOps. But yeah, I mean, we're talking about some of these issues that, IP overlaps and not building big enough subnets, et cetera. Those are kind of traditional IT functions, but in the DevOps context, it's all about speed. So you have to figure out how to not screw those things up, but also kind of deliver to the organization that speed to market, speed to innovation, whatever you want to call it. And I think that's kind of one of the chief challenges for everybody today.
Yeah, in building the slide, I tried to separate out the different types of ops teams, whether it's IT ops or DevOps or SecOps. But as I thought through the conversation, it became apparent that in many cases, these lines don't exist. And in virtually every ops team, there are characteristics of every other ops team, and they have a lot of similarities. And so maybe at the end, we can kind of summarize what some of those similarities are. IT ops is something that really we didn't talk much about until maybe the last year or 18 months. And, DevOps has been around for a while and relates more to sort of your CI/CD pipeline and how you would push out code changes to a SaaS application and then manage that SaaS infrastructure or cloud infrastructure in an ongoing way. But IT operations, and many times, in my experience at least, becomes this umbrella term. And oftentimes will be in an enterprise organization sort of an overlay to many of the other technical organizations, where they sort of try to look at things holistically and maybe consolidate what's happening in individual application ecosystems or business units, where they have their own, I hate to use the word shadow IT, but I think now the reality is that the term IT is pretty antiquated, because in the past it meant sort of anyone who worked directly with technology. But now I think that's the majority of the people working in many companies. And so I think that we're all technologists, and it's an interesting role. I know you talked to several customers that employ an IT ops function. How would you describe sort of what those teams are focused on today?
Yeah, from my perspective, Josh, I look at DevOps a little bit differently. I mean, it's a widely used, then I guess a little bit differently than a lot of people. It's so widely used that it's kind of become vague. So there's everything from specific, DevOps positions in companies to, well, the definition that I prefer a little bit more, that it's more of an approach and a philosophy. So when I think about IT ops, I kind of like to think of, okay, we kind of had our initial kind of more rigid, centralized kind of IT. Well, the modern version of IT has sort of been infused with those DevOps concepts. So it's, in modern IT, how can we increase the speed and agility of the business without sacrificing on the security and stability? And that's sort of the core thrust of the of IT ops. Because again, like DevOps to me is just more of that kind of approach and a sensibility around the speed and agility and those sorts of things. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think what you said was absolutely right, and I think I've seen the same experience. We're going to run out of time, so I want to move forward to the next slide in just a moment. But what I would say before we leave this is, if you're out there and you're interviewing, maybe you've lost your job due to coronavirus or something, DevOps will often be called cloud engineering or cloud operations or cloud services. There are many different names for these things. But I think the key to understand here is that within most organizations that build product, that build code, there are developers that focus on the back end, there are developers that focus on the front end, there are QA teams, but the people that are responsible for pushing that release process out, getting that merged with existing code in a production environment, and then providing stability and performance, oversight to that environment. That's really what DevOps is focused in. And so it's kind of a weird role, because I have seen some pretty junior developers really excel at DevOps. And so a lot of people think of it sort of, as a way in where you might be able to take a generalized skill set with some coding background and really get into a very rewarding and high-paying career that may not rely on such heavy, coding and application architecture skills. Let's go ahead and go forward to the next slide, please.
It should be there, and the interweb should be updating here shortly for you.
I think let's skip NetOps for just a moment, and let's talk about DevSecOps and SecOps. So DevSecOps is easy, right? In many organizations, they sort of combine security operations and development operations, or DevOps, into one function. And as a matter of fact, I would say that as it relates to an application ecosystem, if you're working for like a technology company, a product company, those are almost always the same team. Where I've seen them separated is, if you have a company that has an actual security operations center or a SOC, and you have a team dedicated to securing the environment and watching for threats and protecting against those things for the entire ecosystem, but not necessarily just at a code level. How would you sort of describe those two roles and how they differ, John?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, those are the kind of NetOps and the SecOps, or the network and security teams, have sort of always been kind of constantly at war. Inside enterprise organizations, I think that software-oriented companies that that have a product, they're again more DevSecOps oriented. Those teams have been more converged. I think one of the problems has always been, think about the types of tools and things that security's going to be using. It's network telemetry. They're doing PCAPs, penetration testing and stuff like that. And that's a lot of the same stuff that the network teams are doing. PCAPs on the network. They're doing filtering. They're keeping track of firewall rules and which ports are open and closed. So there's traditionally, what I've seen is those two groups will often buy like redundant tools and kind of have their own little fiefdoms. And to your point before about kind of DevSecOps and the more software oriented companies, that's what I'm seeing a lot of these big companies doing in the cloud. They get to the cloud and all of a sudden you're not going to buy two sets of tools. These NetOps and SecOps are going to be kind of woven into your cloud process, your DevSecOps process.
Yeah, it's really interesting, because if you're a security services provider, an MSP or MSSP, you will likely have a big SOC and basically a SecOps team, but you probably won't have, a DevOps team or maybe a NetOps team. For a large enterprise, you're likely to have all of these things. And, it might just be as simple as understanding the org structure, and the SecOps team may report up to a CISO or something, whereas the NetOps reports to a CIO. But I think the key for me is that if we contrast NetOps and SecOps with what network administration and security, analyst roles were a few years ago, they're very different. A network engineer, a true network engineer working in an environment, you're in many ways historically, iOS knowledge for Cisco and or Juniper or whatever infrastructure you use, Palo Alto, has been a core part of the skill set. Understanding network engineering fundamentals, subnetting and routing and all those things are really important. But now we've added a layer of complexity around scripting and coding. And, I really wouldn't have predicted that the market would have evolved this way. But Python, went through a phase where I kind of thought it might kind of die out. And it has come back with a vengeance, because I see more Python in operations teams when they're doing network automation or security automation, or even within a CI/CD pipeline within Devops. It seems that any sort of development scripting background or coding background, especially with Python, is really, really key. And I think that's the core difference between these modern teams and the teams of history, is that in modern teams, it's all about automation and what you can do through code to elicit change. Because at the speed that we're working today, there's no time to get to a keyboard and type in CLI commands manually to make these changes. You need this stuff to happen automatically when issues are detected, or you have a scaling issue, for example, and you need to, leverage those elastic resources in the cloud to consume more resources and, create new subnets or modify VLANs. That's all done through an automation tool now. And, we invested in a product company called Untitled a few years ago. And Untitled is a network automation player. They work with the largest networks in the world. And, getting to know that product and that team was very informative for me, because they're working every day with NetOps teams and SecOps teams, controlling the largest service provider and enterprise networks out there. And it's all about network as code. And I think that's a big change from the past.
It definitely is. I mean, I was just thinking as you were talking about, I was working on a network issue with a network team that didn't work with a lot of cloud, and we ended up needing to do a PCAP. And the gentleman that I was working with, I could tell his mind was just blown, because the way that I PCAP'd I packet captured on the network in the cloud was I curled an API endpoint, and it returned a file that I could then load up into Wireshark.
Isn't that wild? I mean, that was something that totally unavailable to us not very many years ago.
Yeah, living in the future. So now you can do things like, you could write code that's watching your telemetry. Then when a certain thing happens, you can go through the API and grab kind of a PCAP on demand. And now you can have that served up to your ops team. So a lot of the kind of on the ground blocking and tackling of things that people used to have to do has now, you can automate it. To your point, you can, your real job as a NetOps person is to make sure that the right settings and configurations get into the code pipeline, so you're part of that process. It's much different.
Yeah, and so as we think about, listen to me stammer, as we think about the evolution of these roles and the skill sets required, what I would say to everyone is that in a network operations or security operations role, that development background, that scripting capability, that understanding of application ecosystems and infrastructure, understanding how APIs work. Like that's something that those teams didn't have to worry about historically, but now it's a core part of the job. So if you're out there and you want to evolve from a security analyst or network engineering role into more of a modern NetOps or SecOps role, or if you're just now attending college, what I would tell you is even though you may want to be a security specialist or a network specialist, you need to take some programming classes. You need to understand Python. You need to understand how APIs work, because that's going to be a very important part of that role for the indefinite future. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. Now, we talked about cloud engineering and cloud ops a little bit earlier. I think cloud engineering, in my experience, is synonymous with DevOps. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so
it's at the core.
Say again?
I said it's absolutely at the core. I know we'll get more into it, but when you're thinking about the DevOps pipeline and having your infrastructure exist as code and that, immutability, the person who's engineering it is sort of at the center of it, indispensable.
Yeah, what I've noticed is that the big difference between hiring someone for DevOps and hiring someone for cloud engineering is it costs more to hire a cloud engineer. It's considered a more advanced version of a basic DevOps role. And so, in some ways it might be a little more cloud infrastructure oriented, but I think in reality what we see in the marketplace is that you may start out in DevOps and maybe doing a lot of CI/CD stuff, but the evolution of that role and where you want to get to from a compensation and career, a projection perspective is cloud engineering. Now, cloud ops and cloud architecture, though, to me, are pretty different than cloud engineering or DevOps. And what I see is that organizations often use a cloud ops or a cloud architecture team as sort of an overlay organization to provide standards and around security and stability and scale performance, even cost management for all the different teams that may have their own DevOps teams or even cloud engineering teams. Is that similar to what you've seen and with the customers you work with?
Well, just previously I mentioned that, previously network and security, one of the reasons why they don't in the cloud, on top of the, obviously the fact that those things are a lot of times woven into the code, is that you're exactly right. The cloud ops kind of cloud architecture ends up making a lot of those decisions on the tooling and the dashboards and the requirements and those sorts of things. So that's definitely my experience. I mean, a lot of the companies end up calling that sort of a cloud center of excellence, which might include some members of cloud ops and cloud architecture. It's really evolving quickly, but I think that that's the general trend for sure.
Yeah, it's evolving very rapidly, and I would even argue it's just sort of emerged in the last 18 months. Products like OpsCompass, which is your product, John, are really interesting because they're usually used by this overlay team, sort of a cloud architecture team or a cloud ops team, where they have, multiple teams doing their own DevOps and CI/CD pushes. But you need to have an understanding at the executive level, sort of, how you're doing. Are you more secure than you were a month ago? Are you more compliant than last week? Have you made a configuration change that will dramatically change your cost projection for the quarter and your cloud expenses? And so I think that what we've seen is this pairing of, organizations building out these overlay teams, whether it's cloud ops or cloud architecture, and, investing in a cloud center of excellence and the methodologies that come with that, and then paired with a product like OpsCompass, where they can really, at a glance, understand where they have security and compliance issues, where they have big drift problems. To me, those things just sort of go hand in hand.
Yeah, and it's funny because it's tech, it's technology, it's kind of, cutting edge cloud technology, but, I like to tell our customers even that, digital transformation, it's kind of like a hot buzzwordy type thing. It's far less about the digital than it is about the transformation part of it. And, one of the problems that we set out to solve is that, in a mature cloud organization, you might have 5 or 6 different kind of DevOps pipelines that are feeding different projects. You're probably dealing with business units that have quite a bit of autonomy to use cloud services. A lot of times, the very heavy data science work is done by business units. It's not your traditional IT technical folks. So you end up with this sort of problem of what's the single source of truth if everything's existing in a pipeline checked into code. Like, how do we find problems? It ends up being this sort of transformation of how the whole process and organization works. And it's funny because to me that ends up being a lot more profound than some of the technical issues. Because again, you learn how to write some Python and you leverage the cloud APIs, you can solve lots of technical problems. But those organizational issues with all these things just keep popping up, and that's why I think the roles and the skill sets matter so much. Having those aligned with a real cloud strategy is so important.
What's interesting to me is that in a modern enterprise, you might have 6 or a dozen different engineering teams, each doing their own application development, their own database work, their own network work, shipping out code, dealing with security and cost management, compliance, and that being overseen by some sort of a cloud ops or cloud architecture team who's trying to manage some standards. And none of those people may be in IT. Like, it's very possible that those are just business units and that the IT or the technology is not a back office thing, but it is the business itself. I mean, that is what the company does.
Yeah, it's a completely different mindset. Everything is sort of micro segmented. You hear that most often as a network term, kind of micro segmented networks, but you're really kind of as a IT group who has to somewhat oversee this. You kind of have to micro segment out these different projects and these different kind of internal customers and really deliver your services as an IT group on like a spectrum. For certain apps, it's going to be Fort Knox style kind of lockdown security. And for other things, there's going to be less of an ability for, IT to call those shots. But you still have to be able to meet kind of the organizational goals. So it's definitely more challenging that way because it's more nuanced. It's not as straightforward as it used to be.
From a skill set perspective, I would say that cloud ops and cloud architecture are probably the 2 roles that on a daily basis are the least technical in some ways. And what I mean by that is, in order to be successful in those roles, you will have a very deep technical background, but that will serve as a foundation for the management and the oversight that you'll have to provide. And so this is really one of those roles where you marry executive leadership and the ability to deal with teams with competing goals and objectives with the technical background that gives you the ability to stand tall and have those hard conversations with technologists that are in the code every day that are dealing with that. And so, I would look at this, if you're out there and thinking about career path, as something you're going to see in a larger organization and something you're going to see where you have very senior people that have been application architects and ran DevOps teams and have graduated to a point now where they're going to help provide oversight and standards and management for many different teams of brilliant and opinionated people. So it can be a very challenging role as a leader, but I find it to be a very rewarding role as well.
It's also great to get the attention of senior leadership if you're kind of young and in technology and kind of early getting into the game, because a cloud center of excellence, for instance, or that overlay team almost always has an executive sponsor. And when you can be on that kind of cloud ops team, or you're part of that cloud center of excellence, you're a DevOps, maybe you're a entry-level DevOps person, you're gonna be on the radar of maybe the CIO or the CTO on that cloud team in a way that you wouldn't be potentially in a traditional tech organization. So that's actually one of the things that I think from a career perspective is nice about organizations that are forward thinking about cloud center of excellence and things like that, is it allows for a great upward mobility for those folks involved.
Let's go ahead and go to the next slide, please. As we think about the evolution of technical operations, DevOps and SecOps and NetOps and ITOps, the things we talked about thus far, are pretty similar in many ways. But then you start to hear about some new trends. And I feel like nowadays, you could add the word ops to almost any business function. I hear marketing ops and sales ops and revenue ops and product ops and all these different ops teams. So let's figure out a way to break these up. So maybe we'll keep it easy and we'll talk about the business function ops first. When I think about the difference between a traditional marketing team or a revenue team or a product team and a real ops team, what you're talking about here is the change between managing projects and ideas and work and managing an assembly line. Your metaphor earlier, John, around the Ford assembly line to build cars, I think is really apropos in this conversation, because these business function ops teams, it's really about how do you mechanize sort of the process that you use to make decisions easier and to continue to evolve the business. And I think a lot of high-performing teams have been doing this, for years without maybe having a name for it. But when I go into a company as an investor or an advisor, it's obvious to me within a very short time if they're still figuring out, sales or marketing or how to do product management, or if they've really figured it out and now they're operating, or if they're really advanced and they've not only figured it out, but they've mechanized it and built it into an ops cycle. Have you seen similar things?
Yeah, I think it's kind of like I talked about earlier. It's sort of infusing all these different kind of functions with agile techniques.
Yes.
Everybody's trying to do that. So yeah, I think, and there's been some influential books. I think the Phoenix Project is kind of the quintessential one, but I think it has kind of taken, because so much of businesses are oriented around software today, that yeah, it sort of leaked out into the rest of the organization in material ways.
Well, I also think that in early stage companies, you probably aren't going to see an ops function in these business areas. They're just not mature enough. And you're, in an early startup as a product strategist or product owner or founder, it's as much art as science. You don't have enough data to make data-based decisions. Instead, you pull what little piece of data you can, and then you use your experience and your gut, and you make a judgment call. As the company matures and grows, you start to be able to make more of your decisions based upon data. And once you get to a point that you can make most of your decisions based upon data, then you can begin to mechanize that process and do an operations pipeline. And to me, that's when things really get interesting. And it requires, many different types of skills. It requires technical skills. If you're in a marketing team and you want to spin up a marketing ops function, you're going to need someone with database skills and cloud engineering skills and, at least light programming skills. And the same thing applies whether you're doing revenue or sales or product. They all apply. But what's key here is that it allows you to make investments and conduct experiments that you can measure, mechanize the measurement of those and how you deal with the results, and then operationalize what comes next. And so, one key point I think we should make before we walk away from this, I know we're running out short of time, is this is one of those examples where you're going to find technologists in teams that you may not have looked for them. And in my experience, marketing was one of the first organizations within many enterprises where they were employing technical people, IT people, outside of the IT department. Because the marketing team in many cases was one of the first teams that in often ways, if they're doing, online marketing and e-commerce, they were sort of doing a SaaS business before SaaS was even a thing. And so I think that's something really important to understand. And if you're in those departments, some of the most highly paid and most sought after people I know are specialists in these business function areas who have built operations skills, and they can come into a company and help, string the tools together that they have, whether it's, if you're in marketing and sales, it may be a Salesforce with a Marketo or Omniture and some system on the back end for billing, and then take all the data output from that and put it into an ops pipeline and really start to streamline the business. And to me, that's a beautiful, beautiful thing, but it doesn't happen early. It happens when the company's matured. Let's talk about AI ops and data ops, because we make investments in these areas, and so I talk to a lot of companies in these spaces every week, and I find a lot of similarity between the two. But John, I know you've at least dipped your toe in the water of AI. When you think about sort of AI and data ops, what do you think about?
So I think data ops is really very much now. I think companies have enough. I mean, data is a big enough part of everybody's strategy that, just like with development operations, we're on Portman 2 overload here today. But just like with DevOps, with data ops, it's people saying, hey, we want to get quicker. We want to shorten the time from data to like real information. So shorten the time from raw data set to like on the business dashboards. So they start employing those agile techniques. So that's really grown and now you have regulatory issues and all sorts of things where you need to do better data classification and all those things. That's data ops. AI ops, I think, is very early on. And it's a very deep problem with AI. You talk about something where Python's useful, but that's more issues where you're using all these really complicated kind of algorithms and models, and you need to be able to keep track of which data sets trained on which model. Like right now, there's not a lot of good ways to do that. Labeling of your data. There's lots of really complicated technical problems that are kind of part of AI ops. So I think that it's very immature, but data ops is like today. It's your company's got 20 terabytes of data out in the cloud all over the place, and you need to get that data into dashboards 5 times faster than you used to. It's kind of the problem.
Yeah. What I notice is that data ops is sort of, in many cases, an overlay of what you see within marketing ops and sales ops and product ops. Is a big part of what those ops teams do is they're doing data ops. But what I find interesting about AI ops and data ops is I find them very, very similar in that there's a workload required to ingest and potentially transform data. There's a workload required to build models, and all that kind of happens before any real work takes place, before you begin to do any sort of machine learning or artificial intelligence work, before you really have data that you can find value in. And so what I see in terms of operations is that these aren't one-time acts. They're things that happen continuously on an ongoing basis, and they never really stop. And so when you have a continuous data feed or continuous evolution of your models for AI, you have to be able to build an ops system that allows you to automate and mechanize that entire flow from end to end. And to me, that's maybe how you could summarize what these ops teams really do, is they provide that automation to take raw data or raw inputs, transform, manipulate, combine, process, and end up with some sort of either a business outcome or a business learning or something that you can take advantage of there. And so what you end up with is these two fields of AI and data ops, where you have a heavy need for data scientists and that sort of a data management background. You may also have a heavy need for AI or ML experience on the engineering side if you're doing AI ops. But you also have this core fundamental skill set requirement of how do you build the operations pipeline and how do you automate it. And so I think that this is really our last content slide. What we've sort of said here to summarize is that all of these ops teams require a deep understanding of the entire ecosystem, because you can't really build a pipeline or an automated flow or virtual assembly line without understanding the entire end-to-end process and ecosystem. And I think that what we're learning is that now more than ever, having a foundational experience with engineering best practices and coding, at least with a scripting language like Python, understanding how AI and data ops work, understanding the basics of networking and security. That well-rounded background is super important. I think more so than ever before, which is why I say that while it's awesome that salaries have gone up, and cloud engineering is demanding a high salary right now. High-end, any sort of AI ops or data ops that are well respected and well rewarded compensation-wise. But what we're seeing is this push to where you have to know more and more and more and more, and it allows you to be not just a technologist, but a business manager. And I think that this may cause an evolution in the marketplace where we see more and more technical founders, starting their own business and creating cool products, because I think that we're educating a lot of our technologists on the business fundamentals. And at some point, when you've done this for someone else, you start to say, well, why wouldn't I just do this for myself? Now that I understand the business end to end, now that I understand the technology end to end, and I have the background, why shouldn't I shortcut that? And so we're seeing this rapid evolution of how people can take technology and use it to attain a business outcome in ways that just didn't exist before. Let's go to the next slide. We're pretty much out of time. I apologize. We started a little bit late. I know the sound quality is not very good. John, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for helping today and for being a great co-host. I had a lot of fun.
Hey, likewise, man. Let's do it again soon.
Yeah, we're going to do part 2 next month for everyone out there. Part 2 is going to be more about tools and technologies. We'll talk about the products that people use to manage these ecosystems, the technologies and how they've evolved, the movement from SNMP and ICMP toward API-based management, and just sort of how to do your job and what products and technologies to understand to be more effective. So that'll be the next one. As I mentioned earlier, from a housekeeping perspective, we will send out a recorded version to everyone who attended, and I'm going to try to make the audio work and get a transcription available as well. If you need any of that and don't get it, you can contact us. You can always reach OpsCompass, our sponsor, at sales@opscompass.com, or you can reach out to me or John out on Twitter or LinkedIn or any of the social media channels. Anything else, John, you want to mention before we run out of time?
No, I don't think so.
Awesome. Well, I really, really appreciate everyone's attendance and attention. Hopefully this format where you didn't have to watch and you just listen gave you back part of your day. I think we're all experiencing a little bit of Zoom fatigue nowadays. And so it's nice to just sort of roll back to a podcast format and have a nice conversation about a deep topic. Thank you so much for attending, and we'll catch you guys next month.